The cold in the northern Scottish forests doesn't just sit on the skin. It has intention. Teeth. It finds the broken parts of you and squeezes slowly, as if it knows exactly where to press. I was lying flat on a wide oak branch, about 4 meters off the ground, wrapped in my grandmother's dark wool cloak, the one she'd dyed with walnut bark years before she died. The fabric smelled of earth and cold smoke, and I held onto that smell like it was the only real thing in the world that night. Below me, the ritual had begun. I wasn't supposed to be there. No human was. But supposed to was a phrase that never worked particularly well on me. The Brenevar Circle sat between 3 hills, in a place where the oaks grew twisted, as if the earth had once tried to move away from that spot and given up halfway. The stones marking the perimeter were ancient, older than anything the humans in the nearby village could name. Some had engravings that no one could read anymore. My grandmother could. She used to read them aloud in a low voice when she brought me to the edge of the forest, never beyond. She said they were recognition words, so the land knows who is walking on it. I never understood that until this particular night. The torches burned in a precise circle, their flames strange, too blue at the base, almost white at the top. And they didn't move with the wind I could feel up in the branches, as if the fire obeyed a different physics than mine. Around the torches stood the Lycans, not all of them in wolf form. Most held their human appearance. But there was something in their posture, the way they stayed completely still despite the wind, that made it clear human was just a garment they wore for convenience. I counted in my head, lost track after 40. Warriors in dark fur cloaks, women with long hair braided with metal wire, curved figures I recognized as the clan's eldest, by the way the others instinctively stepped aside for them. At the center stood a stone platform, not elevated enough to be a throne, but high enough that no one around it needed to search for it. On top of it, hands clasped behind his back, stood Cale. I knew it was him before I'd processed any details. There was something in the way the space around him seemed to compress, as if the other bodies were organizing themselves gravitationally around his position. Black hair, almost wet in its darkness under the blue torchlight. A scar descending along the side of his neck, disappearing under his leather collar. Shoulders carrying a permanent tension that wasn't nervousness, but containment. The posture of someone who had spent so long controlling enormous force, that control had become the way they held themselves. The Lycan King of the northern lands. I'd heard stories. Everyone in the village of Danmore had heard stories. That he had taken the throne after a winter of blood no one liked to describe in detail. That he had no mate for 7 years. That the mating ritual performed every lunar cycle was, for him, a tolerated formality. Never a genuine choice. That no she-wolf had been accepted yet. The elder conducting the ritual began to speak. His voice reached me with surprising clarity, as if the air was channeling sound differently that night. An ancient dialect I recognized vaguely from my grandmother's stories. I didn't understand everything, but enough to know the candidates were being invited to present themselves. 6 she-wolves began to move, all of a beauty that seemed to operate by different rules than mine. One had hair that looked like it had been made from embers. Another moved with a fluidity that made my own existence feel clumsy by comparison. They circled the platform in opposite directions, and I noticed Cale following them with his eyes, not with desire, but with the careful attention of someone assessing a threat. That intrigued me more than anything else that night. I tightened my fingers around the branch and shifted my weight slightly, trying to see his face more clearly. A small movement, insignificant. The kind of thing an animal would never ignore. I should have remembered that. The wind changed direction, not gradually. A sudden shift, as if the forest had decided something all at once. My light hair, pinned under the hood, came partially loose, and I felt the cold air sweep from the back of my neck to the edge of the branch, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, of human skin warmed by the effort of being still too long. Cale stopped. Not a pause. An absence, as if someone had switched something off inside him. His head turned slowly, not toward the candidates, not toward the elder still speaking, toward the trees, toward the twisted oak on the northern hillside, toward me. I didn't breathe. He couldn't see me. I was too high, too folded, too covered by my grandmother's dark cloak. But his eyes, even at this distance, even with the blue torchlight distorting everything, were fixed on a point that was too precise to be coincidence. The elder repeated a phrase. The others continued the ritual as if nothing had happened. Kale stayed still long enough for my heart to lurch in a way I felt in my throat. Then, slowly, his lips parted. Not to speak, not to shout, just opened, like someone who has just caught a scent they thought they'd forgotten. And he smiled. It was not a gentle smile. My grandmother had a saying I hated my entire life. Brina, curiosity doesn't just kill cats. She said it every time I went too far, asked too much, spent too long watching things that weren't mine to watch. I always interpreted it as the excessive caution of an old woman who'd lived too long in small places. That night, folded in the oak tree, with the Lycan King smiling at the darkness where I was hiding, I finally understood that my grandmother wasn't being cautious. She was afraid. And she knew exactly of what. The symbol she'd sewn into the inner hem of the cloak, a double spiral with lines crossing at the center, pressed against my wrist where I gripped the fabric. She never explained what it meant. Only said once, in a foggy afternoon when the world seemed smaller than usual, if you ever feel you're being found before you're ready, hold on to this and don't run. Animals chase what flees. I didn't run, but I also couldn't keep pretending I was invisible. Kale descended from the stone platform with a deliberateness that seemed intentional, each step measured, his fur cloak whispering against the wet ground in a sound I could hear even from up there. The elder interrupted the ceremony. The candidates exchanged looks I couldn't decipher. One of the warriors moved to intercept the king, but a single gesture, without even looking at the man, was enough to freeze him in place. Kale walked to the edge of the torch circle, stopped, looked at the forest, and said, in a low voice that reached me with impossible clarity for the distance, as if the words had been spoken directly into my ear, "I know you're there." The cold tightened around my lungs in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. And the worst part, the absolutely worst part, was that something in me, the part my grandmother never managed to domesticate, did not want to stay hidden. I stayed in the branch for a time I can't measure accurately. Could have been 30 seconds, could have been 3 minutes. The kind of paralysis that isn't exactly fear, but looks a lot like it from the outside. Below me, Kale remained at the edge of the torch circle, his back to the ritual, shoulders turned slightly in the direction of the oak. He didn't repeat himself, didn't call for anyone, didn't gesture for warriors to advance. He simply waited, and that was precisely what made me climb down. There is something profoundly disarming about someone who doesn't need to threaten for you to feel the weight of a situation. I had almost no experience with real power, not performative power, but the actual kind. But I recognized it instinctively, the same way you recognize the smell of rain before it starts. Kale didn't need to force me into anything. He simply existed with a gravity that reorganized the options around him. I slid along the branch to the trunk, descended more carefully than quickly, and when my feet touched the moss-covered ground, the impact traveled up through my legs like a reminder that I was made of bone and flesh and nothing more. I walked to the edge of the forest, stopped between the last row of oaks and the open space where the torches burned. The blue light reached my feet, but not my face. I held on to that middle ground like it was worth something. Kale turned his body slowly. The distance between us was about 12 meters, far enough for me to catalog the details I'd missed from above. He was taller than I'd estimated, not absurdly, but enough that the proportion of his broad shoulders seemed even more pronounced. The scar on his neck was more extensive than I'd thought, descending to the collarbone and probably beyond. His eyes were a dark amber that the torchlight made almost orange. But there was something behind that color I couldn't quite name. An intensity that wasn't anger or curiosity. It was recognition, as if he were looking at something he had expected to find. That disturbed me in a way that pure fear never could. "A human?" he said. Not a question. His voice had a deep, slightly rough texture, like someone who doesn't use words frequently, but knows exactly their weight when he does choose to use them. "Apparently," I said. I hadn't planned to say that. It came out before I could filter it, and for a fraction of a second I regretted my own existence. But Cale didn't react with anger. There was a brief pause, almost imperceptible, and then something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not the sharp smile from before, the one that had frozen my blood from above. Something else. Smaller, harder to categorize. Behind him, the circle had quietly collapsed. The 6 candidates were still present, but the formation had dissolved. The red-haired one was looking at me with an expression I could only describe as carefully controlled hatred. 2 others were whispering to each other. The elder observed the scene with narrowed eyes, the look of someone running a calculation that wasn't arriving at the expected result. One of the warriors stepped forward. Big, square jaw, a posture that announced he'd spent his whole life being the physical obstacle between his king and the rest of the world. "Intruder," he said in my direction. "You violated sacred territory. The consequences—" "Maddock." Cale didn't raise his voice. He said the warrior's name with the same intonation he might use to comment on the weather, and it was enough for the man to stop, as if he'd walked into a glass wall. Cale took 3 steps in my direction, stopped about 6 meters away. From this distance I could see the way he breathed, controlled, deliberate, with the quality of someone actively managing something internal while keeping the surface calm. "How did you get here?" he asked. "On foot," I said. A pause. Slightly longer this time. "That's not what I asked." I knew that. He knew I knew. But there was something in the dynamic between us that made me not want to give up ground for free. A stubbornness my grandmother called your worst and best trait. So depending on the day. "I've known this forest since I was 7, I said, more honestly this time. "There's a point on the second hill where the stone fence marking the territory boundary has a gap. It's not wide, but it's enough." "And you found that point how?" "My grandmother showed me." Something shifted in his expression. Too subtle for me to be certain of what I'd seen, but it happened. A deeper recognition, like a memory being slotted into place. "Your name," he said. "Brena." "Just that?" "Brena Calloway, from the village of Danmore." He repeated the surname quietly, almost to himself. Calloway. As if checking it against an internal archive. From the side of the circle, the red-haired woman had separated from the others. Like she'd arrived close enough that I could hear when she spoke, in a tone that pretended to be casual and wasn't. "My king, the ritual hasn't been completed. The moon won't wait. Sarah." The name came out with a coldness that was almost surgical. "Return to the circle." The woman stopped. Her eyes found mine for an instant, and what was in them was the closest thing to a warning I had ever received without words. She turned with a practiced elegance that seemed designed to offend, and went back to the group. I breathed. "You have any idea what you observed tonight?" Cale asked, returning his eyes to me. "A mating ritual. To choose a mate for the king. And knowing that, you stayed." It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't absolution either. It was a pure observation, the kind that forces honesty because it leaves no room for anything else. "Yes," I admitted. "Why?" That was the question I wasn't prepared to answer. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it was too simple to sound decent out loud. The truth was that I'd followed the sound of the drums from the forest's edge because there was something in that rhythm that pulled at a thread in me I didn't know existed, and that the idea of a creature like Cale choosing someone had given me a strangeness in my chest that I'd identified much later, already up in the branch, as envy. I didn't say any of that. Curiosity, I said. He studied me for a moment. That is almost always the beginning of something irreversible. The wind changed again. This time it took my hair to the side. The hood had fallen completely back. The light threads must have caught the blue of the torches, sucked because I saw Cale's eyes move briefly, not with desire, but with that careful attention from before. Cataloging, filing away. From behind him, the elder finally moved. He came with slow, deliberate steps, hands clasped before him, the expression of someone who carries much experience and few illusions. "My king," the elder said, arriving close enough that his voice stayed between the three of us. "What do we do with her?" Cale didn't take his eyes off me when he answered, "She stays." The elder blinked once, slowly. "Protocol dictates." "I know what protocol dictates, Edric." Now there was something sharper in the voice. Not anger, something colder than anger. "I said she stays." The elder looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. There was concern in it, but also something else, something that looked strangely like pity. He inclined his head slightly in my direction, like a greeting that was also a warning, and stepped back. Cale moved one more step toward me. Now we were less than 2 meters apart, close enough for me to notice he smelled of pine and cold metal, and that there was a tension in his jaw that the rest of his posture tried to hide and couldn't quite manage. "You're afraid," he said. Statement, not question. Any sensible person would be. "And yet you stayed in the tree instead of running. My grandmother said animals chase what flees." Something in his eyes shifted. A brief spark, almost imperceptible, that came and went too fast for me to know what it was. "Your grandmother was wise," he said with a quiet that didn't feel calculated. "She was," I agreed. "Or she also said some secrets choose the people, not the other way around." Cale looked at me for a long moment. The ritual behind him had entered a holding pattern. Candidates motionless, warriors tense, the elder wearing that calculating expression I was beginning to recognize as the way he processed the unpredictable. "Brena," said Cale finally, and my name in his voice had a weight I hadn't expected. "What exactly did your grandmother tell you about this place?" And it was there, in that exact moment, that I understood I'd reached the point of no return. Not because he'd blocked my way, but because I needed to know the answer as much as he did. My grandmother was not a woman of many words. She spoke when she had something real to say, and kept silent the rest of the time, with a quality of silence that wasn't empty. It was dense, as like thick fabric, full of things she'd decided to keep. Growing up alongside her was learning to read at the edges, in the way she paused before answering, in how her fingers would stop over any sewing when a particular subject was touched, in the way her eyes went to the north-facing window every time the Lycan clan's drums came carried on the wind on full moon nights. She knew things she never told me directly, but she'd left clues. I was only now beginning to understand them. Standing at the edge of a sacred circle, with the Lycan King looking at me as if I were a word in a language he'd unlearned and just heard again. "She brought me to the edge of the forest several times," I began, choosing words carefully. "Never beyond. She'd show me the perimeter stones from a distance and read the carvings on them. She said they were recognition words." "Binding runes," Cale said, quietly, almost to himself. "She never used that name." He looked away for a fraction of a second, the first real deflection since we'd begun talking. When he returned, there was something different in the expression, more careful. But she knew what they were. "What are they?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. There was a deliberateness in his silences I was learning to recognize. Not evasion, the opposite. The behavior of someone who weighed each piece of information before releasing it, because he knew words did things in the world and couldn't be undone afterward. "Markers," he said finally. "Engraved to identify bloodlines with legitimate access to this place, not any human. Specific lineages that at some point in history made an agreement with the clans." The wind threaded through the oaks. I felt the cold with renewed sharpness. My family, I said. It wasn't a question because it no longer was one. Calloway, he repeated. And this time the name carried a different weight, something being retrieved from a very old archive. How long has your family lived in Danmore? My grandmother said always, that no Calloway had ever been born anywhere else. Cale turned his body slightly to one side, not to step away, but in a posture that seemed instinctive when he needed to process something without the processing being too visible. Let me tell you something, he said, returning his eyes to me with a directness that made my stomach tighten in a way I preferred not to examine closely. And tell me if any part of it corresponds to what you know. I nodded. A little over 100 years ago, there was a conflict between two Lycan clans over control of these lands. The clan my family represents won, but the cost was high. To secure the humans inhabiting the region and ensure our existence would be kept secret, agreements were made. Not written contracts, bonds engraved in the perimeter stones with magic I cannot replicate because it belongs to a time that has passed. Agreements with which families? 3. A pause. One of them was called Calloway. The silence that followed was filled only by the crackle of the torches and the wind through the trees. I felt the symbol sewn into the hem of my grandmother's cloak, pressing against my wrist, where my hand gripped the fabric, and in this time the sensation had a different quality. Not recognition, confirmation. The double spiral, I said almost without meaning to. Cale's eyes went immediately to my hand. You have the symbol. My grandmother sewed it into the cloak. She never explained the meaning. But I paused. She said if I ever felt I was being found before I was ready, I should hold on to it and not run. Cale went absolutely still for a moment. Then he released air slowly. Not a sigh, a controlled release, like someone adjusting the internal pressure of something that was about to overflow. Your grandmother knew, he said, that this was going to happen. She died 4 years ago. I know. That stopped me. How do you know? Because when she died, I felt it. The words came out with a quietness that made it impossible to question their honesty. The bond between the bloodlines registers deaths and births. It's one of the functions it was built for. I don't know the name of who dies or is born. It doesn't work like that. But I feel when the number changes. I looked at him for a long moment. You felt my grandmother die. I felt someone from the Calloway line die. Yes. There was something deeply strange about that. Not frightening, strange in the way of things that retroactively reorganize everything you thought you knew about your own past. My grandmother had died on an October afternoon, peaceful, in bed, with no sign of suffering. And on the other side of the forest, a king had felt something change. She knew about this connection. She never told me. There is more, Cale said. He was watching my expression with the attention that was beginning to bother me in a way that wasn't simple discomfort. But it's not the kind of thing explained standing at the edge of a circle with 20 witnesses 10 meters away. Then what do you propose? That you come to the clan's main hall. I stared at him. You're asking me to voluntarily enter Lycan territory? Yes. After I just spent the past hour watching your mate selection ritual, which was suspended, he said, by you, involuntarily. Then what I'm also asking, I said slowly, is for a guarantee. Not from you, from the stones. Cale blinked, the first genuinely surprised reaction I'd seen from him. You want to invoke the bond? My grandmother taught me that agreements carved in stone don't lie. If the bond exists, as you say, and if my family is part of it, then it protects me inside the territory. I held his gaze. Correct? A long pause. Correct. Then take me to one of the perimeter stones and let me touch the symbol with the cloak. If the magic recognizes the bloodline, I enter. If it doesn't, I leave. And neither of us mentions this night to anyone. Cale looked at me for a time that would have been uncomfortable if I'd yielded to the impulse to look away. I didn't. Then, very slowly, he inclined his head. Not a bow, something closer to recognition. Your grandmother, he said with a quietness that had edges, taught you well. We walked together to the nearest stone at the northern edge. I could feel the eyes of the entire circle following every step. The weight of that collective gaze had its own texture, dense, loaded with things I didn't fully understand but recognized as consequences in formation. The stone was taller than I'd expected up close, almost to my shoulder, rough, covered in lichen at the edges, but with the center exposed where the symbols had been carved deep into the rock. The double spiral was there, identical to the one my grandmother had sewn into the cloak. Around it, other marks I didn't recognize, but that had the quality of language. Too organized to be decoration, too complex to be accident. I opened the hem of the cloak and pressed the fabric against the stone. The embroidered symbol touched the engraved one. What happened next was not dramatic. No light, no sound, no tremor in the ground. There was only warmth, localized, precise, that rose through the fabric, passed through my wrist, traveled up my arm, and settled in the center of my chest with a solidity that felt strangely like belonging. Beside me, Cale closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, something was different, deeper, older. The stone recognized, he said. I know, I replied, because I had felt it. Behind us, in the circle, Edric released a low sound that wasn't quite a word. Maddox had gone absolutely still. Sarah had turned her face to one side, but I could see in the movement of her shoulders that it wasn't disinterest. Cale offered me his hand, didn't grab, didn't demand, simply extended it with his palm facing upward, waiting. I looked at that hand for a moment. I thought about my grandmother, about what she'd known and never told me, about all the ways her silence had been, in truth, a preparation. I placed my hand in his and entered Lycan territory for the first time in my life. Not yet knowing it wasn't the first time the Calloway bloodline had crossed that line. Only the first time in a very long while. The main clan hall was not what I expected. Not raw stone and smoking torches. The ceiling was high and arched, supported by dark oak beams that must have been cut when the trees outside were still saplings. The walls had tapestries, not decorative in the feudal sense, but narrative. Sequences of images woven in dark threads that told stories I'd have needed hours to fully decipher. Cale led me to a smaller room at the back, separated from the main hall by a heavy wooden door without a lock. A table, 2 chairs, a fireplace someone had recently lit. Edric was already there. He explained what needed to be explained. Ia and Cale listened from the wall with his arms crossed, posture I had already identified as how he used when he needed physical distance to think clearly. The Calloway family didn't make a simple agreement with the clans, Cale said from his wall. The bond your family sealed 100 years ago wasn't only about silence, it was about balance. He paused while the fire crackled twice. The 3 families that signed the bond in the stones had specific characteristics, the reason they were chosen above all other human families in the region. What characteristics? Sensitivity to the supernatural, not powers, not active magic, but a permeability. The capacity to sense what most humans filter out unconsciously, smells that shouldn't reach them, sounds beyond the normal spectrum. An instinctive reading of intentions that goes beyond ordinary social perception. I went very quiet, because I knew exactly what he was describing. Since childhood, I had lived with it. The way certain places pressed heavier on me than on others. The metallic smell I noticed before storms that no one else predicted. The ability to know, before someone opened their mouth, whether what they were about to say was true or not. Not infallible, but frequent enough to be unsettling. The others in the village called it women's intuition and dismissed it with a smile. My grandmother never dismissed it. She knew. But you asked what the bond was waiting for, I said, because I needed to understand the full arc before processing the implications. Edric took over. The bond was built with a dual function. Mutual protection was the first. The second was activation. In each generation, there would be a possibility, not a certainty, a possibility, that someone from the bound bloodline and someone from the Lycan bloodline would develop a compatible resonance. Resonance, I repeated. What the ancients called scent recognition, Kale said directly, dropping the diplomatic packaging Edric had used. When a Lycan catches the scent of someone compatible, it isn't only attraction, it's a cellular response. The body recognizes before the mind processes. The silence that settled had a different texture than the ones before. I looked at Kale. He held my gaze without blinking. "You smelled me," I said slowly. "At the ritual." "Yes." "And the ritual was suspended. Why?" "Because none of the candidates were compatible," he said, even with a flatness that made it impossible to question the honesty of the statement. "They never were. 7 years of rituals, and not one she-wolf has presented real resonance. And I have no interest in choosing a mate for political convenience." I processed this for a moment. Kale. It was the first time I had used the name directly, and something in the air of the room shifted when I did. Subtle, but perceptible, like a pressure adjusting. "What you are telling me is that a human from a small village, with an old cloak and a symbol I barely understood, am compatible with the Lycan King of the northern lands. The bond says yes. What I felt says yes. And what do you want to do with that information?" He pushed off from the wall, didn't come toward me, stood in the middle of the room, neither close nor distant. And there was something in that choice I recognized as the kind of care that isn't weakness, but awareness. "Nothing you don't want," he said. "That's not negotiable for me." He paused. "There are complications. The clan council won't accept a human mate for the king without resistance. Sarah has allies. Neighboring clans would interpret this as weakness. A king who chooses a human bound by old magic instead of a she-wolf of strong lineage. Then why tell me all this? Because you have the right to know what is real before you decide what to do with it." His amber eyes met mine with a directness that had no retreat. "And because I spent 7 years refusing something my clan considers an obligation, and I'm not willing to keep refusing for the wrong reasons, I only to accept for equally wrong ones." The council chamber was in the lowest level of the hall, down a stone staircase that narrowed as it descended, as if the space grew more serious as you approached. 7 chairs in an arc. 6 occupied when we entered. Sarah was among them. She had arrived before us, had time to speak to whom she wanted to speak with. The position she'd chosen in the arc placed her directly in my line of sight. It was not accidental. When Kale sat in the 7th chair, the simple act altered the room's dynamics in a way that was almost physical, like a stone being placed at the center of a scale. The white-haired elder woman spoke first. Brina Calloway, from the village of Danmore, bloodline bound by the Brenevar seal. "Yes," I said, voice in the same register, not submissive, not defiant. "You know why you're here?" "Enough." The scarred warrior, Doran, I would learn his name later, went first with substance. What happened at the stone can be explained other ways. The bond's magic has centuries behind it. Degradation in response patterns is documented. What seemed like recognition may have been residue. "I was present," Edric said before I could respond. The activation heat was complete. It was not residue. "You were present as witness, not arbiter," Doran said. "What other kind of evidence would the council consider sufficient?" I asked. He looked at me. No hostility, the kind of professional skepticism that isn't personal, but doesn't yield out of politeness. Then Sarah spoke, for the first time, with a softness that was sharper than any roughness. The king felt what he felt in emotionally charged conditions. An interrupted ritual, an unexpected presence, the novelty of the unpredictable. Physiological responses in Lycans are influenced by context. That's biology, not destiny. There was intelligence in that argument. I needed to acknowledge it before responding. You're saying the king was deceived by his own senses? I said, keeping the tone neutral. Should the council then question the king's sensory capacity as general evidence? A pause. Or only when the result is inconvenient? The silence that followed had a different quality, not heavy with hostility, but heavy with recalibration. I saw one of the neutral warrior's mouth corners move slightly. Not a smile, something adjacent. The white-haired elder intervened. The council doesn't question the king's senses. The relevant question is practical. She looked at me. A human mate for the leader of the northern clans creates real vulnerabilities. Incompatible longevity. Ambiguous position for offspring. Political interpretation by neighboring clans. A pause. These aren't preference arguments. They're legitimate risk analysis. They are, I agreed. That surprised her. I could see the subtle adjustment of posture in at least 3 members. And, I continued, risk analysis ignores the other side of the scale. I kept my voice steady. Not because I was calm, but because I had decided somewhere on the way down those stone stairs that trembling on the inside was acceptable, as long as on the outside I was real rather than performative. The bond was built by people who understood something that any modern risk analysis will underestimate, that the greatest vulnerability of any leadership isn't the weakness of external alliances. It's the internal erosion when the leader lives in contradiction with what is true for them. The room went quiet. 7 years, I continued, because I had started and there was no reason to retreat. 7 cycles of ritual, without a genuine choice. Not because the candidates were inadequate by lineage or strength, but because there was no resonance, and a leader who chooses out of pressure instead of truth doesn't govern from wholeness. He governs from debt. That is also risk analysis. Doran spoke again, and this time the tone had shifted. Not softened, but moved from skepticism to something closer to genuine testing. Yes, do you understand what would be required of you? Concretely, a human in the position of the king's mate faces scrutiny from every allied and enemy clan. There are those who would try to use you as a pressure point. There are those who would try something more direct. I understand, I said. And even so, you're here. My grandmother showed me the gap in the stone fence when I was 7, I said. She didn't take me there to show me what I should avoid. She took me there so I would know the passage existed when I needed it. A pause. People who prepare others for escape aren't preparing for escape. They're preparing for arrival. Edric closed his eyes briefly. Sarah broke the silence, and I gave her credit for not trying to disguise what she was doing. She'd abandoned subtlety and was being direct, at which I respected even knowing it was aimed against me. The council can recognize the bond and still not recommend the union. They're separate questions. The bond is historical. The decision is present, and the present has contexts that magic, 100 years old, didn't anticipate. Sarah. Cale spoke for the first time since we'd entered the room, and the simple fact of him saying her name in that tone made the air's composition change. What you're describing as a political argument is the same argument that has been presented to me in 7 variations over the past 7 years, to justify a choice I was not willing to make. A pause. The council knows me. It knows I don't decide under pressure. That has never changed. Doran spoke again, and this time there was something different in his tone. Less adversarial, more honest. With respect, my king, what has changed is that this time you want to decide, which means the stakes are different. The stakes are always different when the decision is real, Cale said. That's why it's worth making. The council deliberated for 53 minutes, 5 votes in favor, 1 formal refusal, Sarah, who declared her disagreement and ended there without elaboration, 1 registered abstention, which in Lycan protocol, Edric explained to me afterward, was recognition without endorsement. Doran had voted in favor. He spent 20 years arguing that risk analysis ignores the other side of the scale, in military contexts. Edric told me by the main hall fireplace while we waited. Something in his eyes that was almost amusement, very contained, without anyone in the council ever using that language back at him. Lycans respect those who argue well under pressure. It's a characteristic of the species that transcends politics. When the formal declaration came, the Brenevar bond recognized in its full function, the king's declared resonance accepted as legitimate evidence, the question of formal union to be handled with appropriate protocols over the necessary time, without pressure of ritual calendar. I sat for a moment with what had just happened. Cale came to stand near me, not invading the space, but close enough that his voice was low, and only mine. "You were real in there," he said. "I was terrified," I told him. "I know." A pause. "So were they. That's why it worked." The winter passed with a slowness I learned to inhabit rather than resist. I didn't move into clan territory immediately. That would have been unwise, and everyone knew it. But the gap in the stone fence my grandmother had shown me with such precision became a path I traveled in both directions, with a regularity that gradually became routine. I learned things. I learned that Maddock, beneath the stone wall, had a completely dry sense of humor that appeared in unexpected moments and disappeared just as quickly, leaving you uncertain whether it had happened. I learned that Rihanna, the woman who had been sewing by the window the night I arrived, knew the entire history of the clan with a precision that made written records secondary, and that she shared this knowledge in fragments I spent months stitching together into a narrative that began to illuminate things about my own family I had spent years not understanding. I learned Cale, not all at once, not in a straight line, in fragments, in silences, in conversations that began about one thing and arrived somewhere else without either of us having planned it. I learned that he had assumed the throne at 26, after a winter he didn't describe in detail, but that had left marks beyond the scar on his neck. That the containment I had interpreted as distance was in fact the opposite, the manner of someone who feels everything with an intensity most people can't imagine, and who had learned by necessity to build structure around it. I learned that there was a specific point on the northern hill where he went when he needed real silence, and that after a certain point, he went there one afternoon and found me already sitting there, and neither of us pretended it was coincidence. Sarah left the clan in the spring, not expelled, her own choice. You announced with the composure that was her characteristic. A relocation to an allied clan in the east, where her political intelligence would find more receptive ground. She looked at me one last time before leaving, in a moment when we were alone in the hall corridor, and said only, "Don't waste what was given to you." It wasn't kindness, it was a demand. I told her I wouldn't waste it, and it was the most honest exchange we had. The formal union happened on a September night at the edge of the Brenevar stones, with the circle of blue-flamed torches, and the elder Edric conducting words I now understood completely, because I had spent the preceding months learning the ancient dialect with a persistence Edric had called impressive, and Cale had called inevitable. There were no 6 candidates in a line. There was only me, and with my grandmother's dark wool cloak over my shoulders, and the metal of the double spiral at my wrist, standing at the same forest edge where everything had begun. Only this time, on the inside. Cale stood facing me, those amber eyes I had learned to read with a precision that still surprised me sometimes. And there was in them, beneath all the containment, beneath all the structure he'd built around the intensity that inhabited him, something I could only describe as relief. The kind that only appears when something that has been wrong for too long finally corrects itself. Maddock stood back and to the right, posture unchanged, but I had learned to read Maddock well enough to know that what was underneath was satisfaction. Rihanna stood on the opposite side, eyes bright in a way she wasn't making any effort to manage, and Doran stood near the outer stones, arms crossed looking at the horizon, but he was there. When Edric pronounced the final words of the ritual and Cale placed his hand in the air before me, not grabbing, not demanding, exactly as that first night, palm facing upward, waiting, I felt the same warmth that had traveled through the cloak's fabric when the symbol touched the stone. Only this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. My grandmother had sewn the double spiral into a cloak because she knew that one day I would need to be recognized before I was ready. She also knew, I was certain of this now, with the certainty of things that don't need proof because they're felt in the architecture of what happened, that when the moment came, I would be ready anyway. I placed my hand in his. The Brenovar stones stood around us as they always had, with their ancient marks, their carved spirals, holding the agreement between worlds that my family had honored for generations without fully knowing they were doing so. The wind came from the north, as it always did in that place. And for the first time in my life, it didn't smell of cold and absence. It smelled of arrival.